My name is Saren Mitchell. I'm 28, and I thought I knew my family until last Thanksgiving changed everything forever. What started as our usual family dinner with my parents bragging about my golden boy brother Derek's new mansion turned into the moment I discovered a devastating secret that would tear our family apart and expose 20 years of lies. The laughter at that dinner table, my parents mocking my modest apartment while praising Derek's success, became the catalyst for a revelation so shocking it would destroy everything they believed about their precious son and force them to confront the ugly truth about favoritism, manipulation, and blood money. Before we dive into this wild journey of family betrayal and sweet justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're ready for a story that'll have you questioning everything you thought you knew about family loyalty, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this revenge tale has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming, and by the time we're done, you'll understand why sometimes karma needs a little help from those who've been wronged. Let's get into this absolute chaos. Growing up as Derek's little sister meant living in a perpetual shadow that seemed to grow darker with each passing year. While I was struggling through community college working 2 part-time jobs to pay for my education, Derek was the family's shining star, full scholarship to Stanford internships at prestigious firms, and what seemed like an endless stream of opportunities falling into his lap like autumn leaves. Our parents, Margaret and Robert Mitchell, never missed a chance to remind me of the stark differences between their children. Derek's already making 6 figures at 25. Mom would say, while I served tables at the local diner, maybe you should ask him for career advice, honey. Dad was even more direct. Your brother has that natural business instinct, Saren. Some people are just born with it, others have to work a little harder to find their place. The worst part wasn't even the constant comparisons, it was the way they dismissed my achievements entirely. When I graduated with my associate degree in accounting, they gave me a card and a $20 gift certificate to Target. When Derek got his MBA, they threw him a party that cost more than my entire semester's tuition. I watched from the kitchen, helping Mom prepare appetizers for guests who barely acknowledged my existence, while Derek held court in the living room, regaling everyone with stories of his internship at Goldman Sachs. But it was Derek's house that really drove the knife deeper. At 26, he'd purchased a sprawling 4-bedroom colonial in the most exclusive neighborhood in our town. The down payment alone was more money than I'd ever seen in my life, and according to Derek, he'd saved it all himself through smart investments and living frugally. I found this curious, since Derek had never been particularly frugal. His closet was full of designer suits, he drove a BMW, and his social media was filled with expensive vacations and 5-star dining experiences. When I asked him once how he'd managed to save so much while maintaining such an expensive lifestyle, he just winked and said, "I'm really good with money, sis. Maybe someday I'll teach you." The condescension in his voice made my skin crawl, but I bit my tongue. Family harmony was more important than my hurt feelings, or so I told myself. The house became the centerpiece of every family gathering. Mom would give tours to relatives, pointing out the granite countertops, the hardwood floors, the 3-car garage. Derek picked out everything himself, she'd beam. He has such sophisticated taste. Meanwhile, I was still living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery, working as a bookkeeper for small businesses and freelancing on weekends to make ends meet. The breaking point should have come sooner, but I kept telling myself that families weren't supposed to be perfectly fair. Parents were allowed to have favorites, and maybe Derek really was just more successful than me. Maybe I needed to work harder, be smarter, try different approaches. The gaslighting was so subtle, so consistent, that I began to believe I really was the failure they implied I was. Then came the family dinners at Derek's house, which became a monthly tradition. Mom and Dad would arrive with expensive wine and elaborate flower arrangements, treating these gatherings like visits to royalty. They'd spend hours admiring Derek's latest home improvements, the new Italian leather furniture, the smart home system, the wine cellar he'd had installed in the basement. Every detail was discussed, praised, and photographed for social media. During these dinners, I became invisible. Conversations flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture. Derek would talk about his work, his investments, his plans to expand the house. Mom and Dad hung on every word, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement. When I tried to contribute, mentioning a new client I'd landed or a certification I was pursuing, the conversation would shift back to Derek within minutes. The psychological toll was devastating. I began to question my worth, my intelligence, my place in the family. Was I really that unremarkable? Had Derek somehow inherited all the talent and ambition while I got the leftovers? The worst part was that Derek seemed to genuinely believe he deserved all the attention and praise. There was no malice in his condescension, which somehow made it worse. He really thought he was superior, and our parents had given him every reason to believe it. Last Thanksgiving was supposed to be special because Derek had just closed on an investment property, a second home in the mountains that he planned to rent out for passive income. Mom had been talking about it for weeks, practically vibrating with excitement about her son's latest achievement. Derek's building a real estate empire, she'd tell anyone who would listen. He's going to be a millionaire before he's 30. The dinner was held at Derek's main house naturally, and I arrived with a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford, and a forced smile I'd been practicing in the mirror. The house was decorated like something from a magazine, professional wreaths, coordinated table settings, and enough ambient lighting to make everyone look like they were posing for a holiday card. As usual, Derek dominated the conversation from the moment we sat down. He described the mountain property in excruciating detail: the vaulted ceilings, the stone fireplace, the hot tub on the deck overlooking the valley. The rental income should cover the mortgage, plus give me about $2,000 in profit each month, he explained, cutting into his perfectly prepared turkey. It's all about leveraging your assets and understanding market dynamics. Dad nodded sagely, as if Derek had just revealed the secrets of the universe. That's exactly the kind of forward thinking that separates successful people from everyone else, he said, glancing meaningfully in my direction. Some people think small, others think strategically. I tried to contribute by mentioning that I'd been researching real estate myself, thinking about maybe saving for a small condo. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Mom actually laughed, not a kind chuckle, but a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the room like a blade. "Oh, honey," she said, still smiling in that patronizing way that made my chest tight, "you're so sweet, but let's be realistic. You can barely afford your little apartment above that bakery." Derek's success comes from years of careful planning and smart decisions. You'll never own a house like your brothers. Maybe you should focus on finding a nice man who can provide for you, instead of these unrealistic career fantasies. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek looked uncomfortable for about 2 seconds before launching into another story about his property management plans. Dad simply nodded in agreement with Mom's assessment, cutting his turkey with surgical precision. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, feeling like I'd been slapped. But then something shifted. Instead of the usual shame and self-doubt, I felt a cold, clear anger settling in my chest. There was something about Mom's tone, something about the way Dad avoided my eyes, that triggered a memory I'd been trying to ignore for months. Earlier that year, I'd been doing bookkeeping for a small construction company, and I'd noticed some irregularities in their accounts payable. Nothing dramatic, just invoices that seemed inflated, and payments to vendors that didn't match the work described. When I'd brought it to the owner's attention, he'd gotten defensive and eventually fired me, claiming I was overstepping my boundaries. But the experience had taught me to recognize the signs of financial manipulation. Sitting at that Thanksgiving table listening to Derek describe his various investments and property acquisitions, those same red flags were going off in my head. The timeline didn't add up. The amounts were too large for someone his age with his documented income. The casual way he talked about having cash on hand for opportunities suggested access to money that shouldn't have existed. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead I found myself in Derek's home office. I told myself I was just curious, just wanted to understand how he'd achieved so much at such a young age. Maybe there really was something I could learn from his success. The office was as immaculate as the rest of the house, organized, files, expensive furniture, multiple monitors displaying what looked like investment portfolios. But it was the family photos on his desk that caught my attention. There was one I'd never seen before, Derek with our grandfather, taken about 5 years ago, both of them standing in front of a bank. Our grandfather, Samuel Mitchell, had died when Derek was 23 and I was 21. He'd been a successful businessman who'd built a small empire of hardware stores throughout the region. At the funeral, the family lawyer had explained that Grandpa Sam had left most of his estate to charity with small inheritances for his grandchildren, $5,000 each to be held in trust until we turned 25. I'd received my inheritance right on schedule, using it to pay off student loans. Derek had mentioned getting his around the same time, claiming he'd invested it wisely. But looking at that photo, something clicked. The timeline of Derek's sudden financial success aligned perfectly with Grandpa Sam's death. And Derek had always been Grandpa's favorite, the one who'd spent summers working at the hardware stores learning the business. Standing in that office surrounded by evidence of wealth that seemed impossible to achieve legitimately, I realized that my entire family dynamic had been built on a lie. Derek's success, the success that had been used to diminish me for years, wasn't the result of superior intelligence or business acumen. It was something else entirely, something that would explain why my parents were so invested in protecting his image, and why questioning his achievements was always shut down so quickly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped me back to reality. I quickly left the office and returned to the dining room, where the conversation had moved on to Derek's plans for New Year's Eve in Aspen. But I could barely concentrate on the words. My mind was racing, connecting dots that painted a picture I wasn't ready to fully accept. As we said our goodbyes that night, Mom hugged me and whispered, "Don't take what I said personally, sweetheart. I just want you to be realistic about your limitations." But I wasn't thinking about limitations anymore. I was thinking about that photo, about timelines that didn't add up, and about the careful way our entire family had been trained never to question Derek's version of events. Driving home to my cramped apartment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out the truth about Derek's success, even if it destroyed the family in the process. Because I was beginning to suspect that the golden child wasn't quite as golden as he appeared, and that my years of feeling inadequate had been based on a foundation of lies that ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My clients' financial records blurred together as I sat in my tiny office space rented by the hour from a shared workspace downtown. Every number on every spreadsheet reminded me of the discrepancies I'd noticed in Derek's timeline, and I found myself making calculation errors that I'd never made before. By Wednesday, I'd made a decision that terrified and excited me in equal measure. I was going to investigate my own brother. The first step was gathering information I could access legally. I started with public records, property deeds, tax assessments, business licenses. What I found made my stomach drop. Derek didn't just own the house and the mountain property. Over the past 4 years, he'd accumulated 6 different real estate investments across 3 counties, with a combined value of over $3 million. For someone who claimed to have started with nothing but a college degree and entry-level salary, this level of wealth accumulation was not just impressive, it was impossible. Even with the most aggressive saving and the luckiest investment timing, the numbers simply didn't work. Derek would have needed access to capital that far exceeded anything he could have legitimately earned or borrowed. I spent my lunch break at the county clerk's office, diving deeper into the property records. Each purchase showed Derek making substantial down payments, 20% or more, on properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The first purchase, his primary residence, had required a down payment of $80,000. According to his social media posts and family conversations, he'd bought that house just 6 months after Grandpa Sam's funeral. That night, I called our cousin Lisa, who lived across the country but had always been close to the family. Lisa was a paralegal with access to resources I didn't have. And more importantly, she'd never bought into the Derek worship that seemed to consume the rest of our relatives. "Saren, it's been forever," she said when she picked up. "How was Thanksgiving with the golden boy?" Her casual sarcasm gave me the opening I needed. "Actually, that's kind of why I'm calling." "Lisa, do you remember anything unusual about Grandpa Sam's will? I mean, besides leaving most of his money to charity." There was a pause. "You know, now that you mention it, there was something weird." My mom said the lawyer seemed surprised by the will, like genuinely shocked, and Derek spent a lot of time at Grandpa's house those last few months before he died. I remember thinking it was sweet that he was being so attentive, but what? Well, Grandpa was starting to have some memory issues, wasn't he? And Derek was always so charming, so good at getting what he wanted. I hate to say this about family, but I sometimes wondered if he was influencing a sick old man. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Lisa shared details I'd either forgotten or never known: how Derek had insisted on handling many of Grandpa's affairs in those final months, how he'd been present for several meetings with the lawyer, how he'd seemed unusually invested in understanding the details of the estate. By the time we hung up, we'd both agreed that something didn't add up, and Lisa had offered to help me dig deeper using her legal research skills. The real breakthrough came 3 days later. Lisa called me at work, her voice tight with anger and disbelief. "Saren, you need to sit down for this," she said. "I found the original will." My hands started shaking before she even continued. "Grandpa Sam didn't leave his money to charity. He left it to his grandchildren, all of it. The estate was worth $2.8 million, and it was supposed to be split equally between you and Derek. But there's a second will dated just 2 weeks before he died that changes everything. Suddenly you get $5,000. Charity gets a token amount, and Derek gets the rest." The room started spinning. That's over $1 million. $1.4 million to be exact. "And Saren, I've seen enough estate cases to know what this looks like. The handwriting analysis, the witness signatures, the timing, this has all the hallmarks of elder fraud. Someone convinced a dying man to change his will, and given Derek's presence during that time." I couldn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. We both knew what this meant. My brother hadn't built his success through intelligence and hard work. He'd stolen it from a vulnerable old man, our own grandfather, and in doing so, he'd stolen my inheritance, my future, and my family's respect for me. For 5 years, I'd been made to feel inferior to someone who was essentially a thief. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. Lisa explained that challenging a will after 5 years would be nearly impossible, especially since the original witnesses were deceased, and Grandpa Sam obviously couldn't testify about his true intentions. We needed more evidence, something that would clearly demonstrate Derek's deception. That's when I remembered something else from Thanksgiving dinner: Derek mentioning his private financial advisor and how he'd learned to optimize his tax strategies. Someone with over $1 million in questionable income would need help hiding it from the IRS, and financial advisors kept detailed records. The plan that began forming in my mind was risky, potentially illegal, and would definitely destroy my relationship with Derek forever. But sitting in my tiny apartment that night, eating ramen noodles while my brother posted Instagram photos from his ski weekend in Colorado, I realized I didn't care about maintaining relationships built on lies and theft. I was going to expose Derek, and I was going to get my inheritance back no matter what it cost. Over the next week, I began laying groundwork. I reached out to old friends from high school who now worked in various professional fields: banking, real estate, tax preparation. I started asking casual questions about estate law, inheritance procedures, and how someone might go about hiding large sums of money. I presented everything as general curiosity or hypothetical scenarios, but I was building a network of people who could help me understand Derek's methods. The most useful contact turned out to be my old friend Marcus, who worked for a private investigation firm. When I finally worked up the courage to tell him the whole story, he listened without judgment and then offered advice that changed everything. "Saren, what you're describing isn't just family drama," he said. "This is elder fraud, inheritance, theft, and probably tax evasion. But you're right that proving it won't be easy. However, if Derek really did steal over $1 million, he's had to do something with that money. Money leaves trails, especially large amounts. The question is whether you're prepared to follow those trails wherever they lead." Standing at this crossroads, I realized that this investigation had become about more than money. It was about justice, truth, and refusing to accept a reality built on lies. Derek had stolen more than my inheritance. He'd stolen my self-worth, my family's respect, and 5 years of my life spent believing I was somehow less worthy than him. But that was about to change. I was done being the underestimated little sister, and Derek was about to learn that blood loyalty has its limits, especially when that blood has been tainted by greed and deception. The war was just beginning and I intended to win. But before we dive deeper into the investigation that would ultimately destroy Derek's carefully constructed empire, I have to pause and ask, have any of you ever felt like something about a family member's success story just didn't add up? That nagging feeling when the timeline doesn't quite work, when the explanations feel too smooth, too perfect. Drop a comment below if you've ever questioned whether someone close to you was hiding something major. Because what I discovered next made me realize that my instincts had been screaming the truth at me for years. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this investigation unfolded, because the evidence I found was even more shocking than the stolen inheritance. Trust me, this story is just getting started. Armed with Marcus's advice and Lisa's legal research skills, I spent the next month becoming an expert in financial forensics. I learned about money laundering techniques, offshore accounts, and the various ways wealthy people hide assets from tax authorities. More importantly, I learned that people who commit financial crimes usually can't resist the temptation to live beyond their means, leaving traces of their illegal wealth everywhere. Derek was no exception. The first major discovery came when I started tracking his social media activity more carefully. His Instagram account was a goldmine of evidence: expensive watches, designer clothes, luxury vacations, exclusive restaurants. I began screenshotting everything and creating a timeline of his purchases. Even with his documented income from his legitimate job, the lifestyle he was displaying would have been impossible to maintain while simultaneously saving for multiple real estate investments. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Remember Mrs. Chen, my elderly landlord who owned the bakery below my apartment? It turned out she was also Derek's accountant's mother-in-law, and she'd overheard some interesting conversations during family dinners. "Your brother, he brings many cash deposits to David's office," Mrs. Chen told me one evening as I picked up my favorite almond cookies. "David, he always nervous when your brother comes. Last month, David tell his wife he worry about some client who bring too much cash, make him file suspicious reports. I think maybe your brother caused this worry." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. If Derek's accountant was filing suspicious activity reports with the IRS, it meant there was an official paper trail documenting unusual financial behavior. Marcus helped me understand that while I couldn't access these reports directly, their existence suggested that Derek was already on the radar of federal investigators. But I needed more concrete evidence, something that would clearly link Derek's wealth to Grandpa Sam's stolen inheritance. That's when Lisa made another crucial discovery. "I've been digging into the witnesses who signed Grandpa's second will," she called to tell me. One of them was Derek's college girlfriend, Sarah Morrison. She moved to Arizona right after graduation, but I found her LinkedIn profile. Saren, she works for a nonprofit that provides legal aid to elder abuse victims. If anyone would be willing to talk about what really happened with that will, it would be someone who now dedicates her life to protecting vulnerable seniors. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to contact Sarah. When I finally called her, pretending to be organizing a college reunion, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. "Derek Mitchell," she said, her voice immediately turning cold. "I haven't spoken to him since college and I never plan to. That man. Let's just say I learned some things about his character that I'll never forget." I sensed an opportunity. "Actually, Sarah, this isn't really about a reunion. This is about my grandfather's will, and I think you might have information that could help me understand what really happened." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting 5 years for someone to ask me about that." What Sarah told me over the next hour shattered any remaining doubt about Derek's guilt. She'd been present when Derek forged the signature on the second will, using documents he'd stolen from Grandpa Sam's house during one of his caring visits. She'd signed as a witness because Derek had convinced her they were helping a confused old man organize his affairs, but she'd realized later that they'd actually been committing a felony. "I wanted to come forward," Sarah explained, "but Derek threatened me. He said if I ever told anyone what really happened, he'd claim I was the one who initiated the fraud. He had photos of me signing the documents, and he said he'd make sure I went to prison while he walked free." I was 22 years old and terrified. So I kept quiet and tried to forget it ever happened. "But you specialized in elder abuse law afterward," I said, understanding finally clicking. "Every victim I help is my way of making amends for not helping your grandfather. Derek stole from a dying man, Saren, and he did it with such casual cruelty that it changed how I see the world. Your grandfather was trying to ensure both his grandchildren had financial security, and Derek took that away from you for pure greed." Sarah agreed to provide a sworn affidavit detailing what she'd witnessed, but she warned me that Derek wouldn't go down without a fight. "He's had 5 years to cover his tracks and build his story. He'll have explanations for everything, and your parents will believe him because they've invested too much in his image to accept the truth." She was right about my parents. When I finally confronted them with the evidence I'd gathered, their reaction was immediate and vicious denial. Mom accused me of being jealous and delusional. Dad suggested I needed therapy to deal with my obvious mental health issues. They refused to look at the documents Lisa had found, dismissed Sarah's affidavit as lies from a bitter ex-girlfriend, and warned me that if I continued spreading these malicious rumors, they'd have no choice but to cut me out of their lives entirely. "Derek has worked hard for everything he has," Mom said, her voice shaking with anger. "Just because you've made poor choices doesn't give you the right to tear down your brother's success. This jealousy is ugly, Saren, and it's destroying our family." The gaslighting was so intense, so coordinated, that I began to wonder if my parents had known about Derek's theft all along. Their complete refusal to even consider the evidence suggested they were either willfully blind or actively complicit. Either way, it was clear that blood loyalty meant more to them than justice or truth. But I wasn't backing down. If anything, their reaction convinced me that I was on the right track. Derek had built his entire life on stolen money, and my parents had become unwitting accessories after the fact, enabling his fraud by constantly praising his success and using it to diminish me. The next phase of my investigation focused on Derek's financial advisor, a man named Kenneth Walsh, who operated out of a small office downtown. Marcus helped me research Walsh's background, and what we found was disturbing. Walsh had been sanctioned twice by financial regulatory authorities for questionable client advisory practices, and had a history of working with clients who needed to hide assets from various authorities. Getting access to Derek's financial records through Walsh would be impossible without a court order, but I had another idea. I started volunteering at a local tax preparation service that offered free help to low-income families. The work was legitimate and helpful, but it also gave me access to tax software and training that helped me understand how someone might hide large amounts of unreported income. What I learned terrified me. Derek wasn't just hiding stolen inheritance money, he was probably committing ongoing tax fraud on a massive scale. The lifestyle he was maintaining, combined with his property acquisitions, suggested an annual income of at least $400,000. But his documented salary was less than half that amount. The difference had to be coming from somewhere, and given his history with Grandpa Sam's will, I had a pretty good idea where. By the end of February, I had enough evidence to prove Derek's fraud to anyone willing to listen. But I also knew that confronting him directly would only give him time to cover his tracks further. Instead, I decided to take a different approach, one that would expose him publicly and make it impossible for him to continue his deception. Derek was planning a housewarming party for his new mountain property in March, inviting the entire extended family to celebrate his latest achievement. He'd been bragging about it for weeks, describing the renovations he'd made and the professional catering he'd arranged. It was going to be his biggest showing-off event yet, a chance to demonstrate his superiority to everyone who'd ever doubted him. It was also going to be the perfect opportunity for me to reveal the truth about how he'd really paid for everything they'd be admiring. With dozens of family members present, including several who worked in law enforcement and finance, Derek wouldn't be able to dismiss my evidence as easily as my parents had. But first, I had one more piece of evidence to gather, something that would make Derek's guilt undeniable even to his most devoted supporters. And I knew exactly where to find it. March arrived with unseasonably warm weather, as if nature itself was preparing for the explosion that was about to tear through our family. Derek's housewarming party was scheduled for the third Saturday of the month, and he'd been insufferably excited about it for weeks. The guest list included over 40 people, cousins, aunts, uncles, family, friends, and several of Derek's colleagues who'd become convinced of his financial genius. But I had my own preparations to make. Working with Marcus and Lisa, I'd spent the previous weeks organizing all our evidence into a comprehensive presentation. We had Sarah's sworn affidavit about witnessing the will forgery financial timeline analysis, showing Derek's impossible wealth accumulation. Screenshots of his social media posts, documenting a lifestyle inconsistent with his reported income, and most damning of all, we'd managed to obtain copies of the suspicious activity reports Derek's accountant had filed with the IRS. The breakthrough on the financial records came from an unexpected source: Kenneth Walsh's ex-secretary, a woman named Patricia, who'd been fired for asking too many questions about client confidentiality protocols. Patricia had kept copies of certain documents as insurance against Walsh, trying to implicate her in any illegal activities. And when Marcus approached her with our evidence about Derek, she agreed to provide additional documentation in exchange for anonymity. What Patricia gave us was devastating. Not only had Derek been structuring cash deposits to avoid federal reporting requirements, but he'd also been using his real estate investments to launder money through fake renovation expenses and inflated property management fees. The mountain property alone had generated over $200,000 in fraudulent tax deductions through fictional construction work and non-existent business expenses. But the most shocking discovery was a recorded conversation between Derek and Walsh from just 6 months earlier. Patricia had been instructed to transcribe phone calls for billing purposes, but she'd kept a recording of this particular conversation because of how disturbing it was. In the recording, Derek casually discussed expanding his money laundering operation, mentioning potential new opportunities to acquire additional assets through family connections. When Walsh expressed concern about increased IRS scrutiny, Derek laughed and said, "My family thinks I'm a genius businessman. As long as they keep believing that story, I can do whatever I want." They'd rather live in fantasyland than face the truth about where the money really comes from. Listening to that recording was like having my heart torn out and stomped on. Derek wasn't just a thief, he was a narcissistic sociopath who took pleasure in deceiving the people who loved him. He'd built his entire identity around being superior to me, knowing full well that his success was based on fraud and theft. Worse, he was planning to continue stealing, possibly targeting other vulnerable family members. The party was being held on Saturday afternoon with guests arriving at 2 o'clock for drinks and appetizers, followed by a full tour of the property. Derek had hired professional caterers and even a bartender, sparing no expense to impress everyone with his latest acquisition. According to his Instagram posts, the total cost of the party was over $15,000 more than I earned in 3 months. I arrived exactly on time, carrying what appeared to be a gift bag, but actually contained a tablet, loaded with all our evidence and a portable speaker for audio files. My plan was simple. Wait until Derek gathered everyone for his inevitable speech about his success and hard work, then systematically destroy his lies in front of the entire family. The property was even more impressive than Derek's descriptions had suggested. The house sat on a ridge overlooking a pristine valley with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a wraparound deck that offered breathtaking views. Professional landscaping had transformed the natural setting into something that belonged in a luxury magazine, and Derek had clearly spared no expense on furnishings and decor. As guests arrived, the conversation followed predictable patterns. Derek held court in the main living room, describing his renovation process and investment strategy to an audience of relatives who hung on every word. Mom and Dad flanked him like proud bodyguards, occasionally adding details about their son's remarkable business acumen and natural talent for recognizing opportunities. I mingled quietly, listening to the praise being heaped on Derek and feeling the familiar burn of injustice in my chest. But this time the feeling was accompanied by anticipation rather than despair. Every compliment, every expression of admiration, every comment about Derek's success was building toward a reckoning that would recontextualize everything these people thought they knew about him. The moment I'd been waiting for came during dessert. Derek stood up with a glass of champagne, calling for everyone's attention as he prepared to give what he called a little speech about gratitude and hard work. The room fell silent, 40-plus people turning toward their host with expressions of warm expectation. I want to thank everyone for being here today. Derek began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of humble bragging that had always made my skin crawl. This property represents more than just an investment to me. It's proof that in America, if you're willing to work hard and make smart decisions, you can achieve anything you set your mind to. The murmurs of agreement around the room made me feel sick. These people genuinely believed they were looking at a self-made success story, a young man who'd earned everything through merit and determination. They had no idea they were actually admiring the proceeds of elder abuse and ongoing financial fraud. Derek continued, his confidence growing with each word. I know some people think I've been lucky or that success came easily to me. But the truth is, everything you see here, this house, my other properties, my lifestyle, it all comes from understanding how money works, how investments grow, and how to recognize opportunities that other people miss. He paused to take a sip of champagne, his eyes scanning the room with obvious satisfaction. I learned these lessons from the best teacher anyone could have, our grandfather, Samuel Mitchell. Grandpa Sam taught me that success isn't about waiting for opportunities to come to you. Sometimes you have to create your own opportunities, even if other people don't understand your methods. That was it. That was the moment Derek sealed his own fate. Standing up slowly, I pulled out my tablet and connected it to the portable speaker I'd hidden behind a potted plant. "You're absolutely right, Derek," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "Grandpa Sam did teach you about creating opportunities. In fact, I have a recording of you discussing exactly what you learned from him." The color drained from Derek's face as I pressed play, and his own voice filled the room. "My family thinks I'm a genius businessman. As long as they keep believing that story, I can do whatever I want. They'd rather live in fantasy land than face the truth about where the money really comes from." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the room, watching as confusion turned to understanding, then to horror on the faces of people who'd spent years believing Derek's carefully crafted lies. But this was just the beginning. I had hours of evidence to present, and Derek's world was about to come crashing down in the most public, humiliating way possible. The revolution had finally begun. The recording played for exactly 47 seconds, but it might as well have been a nuclear bomb, detonating in Derek's perfectly appointed living room. 43 faces turned from Derek to me and back again, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror as the implications sank in. Derek's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor he'd bragged about installing himself. Mom let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Dad's face went completely white, then red, then white again like a broken traffic light. "Saren, what the hell?" Derek started, but I cut him off. "Oh, we're just getting started, big brother." I tapped the tablet screen, bringing up the timeline Lisa and I had created. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you the real story of Derek Mitchell's success. It begins 5 years ago when our grandfather Sam was dying and making his final will. What followed was the most satisfying 20 minutes of my entire life. I systematically dismantled Derek's lies piece by piece, showing the original will that left Grandpa Sam's $2.8 million estate to both grandchildren equally, then the forged second will that gave Derek everything. I played Sarah's testimony about witnessing the forgery. I displayed the financial analysis, proving Derek's lifestyle was impossible on his legitimate income. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Uncle Mike, who worked for the FBI, was taking notes on his phone. Cousin Janet, a CPA, was staring at Derek like she'd never seen him before. Our family friend, Mr. Rodriguez, who'd known Grandpa Sam for 40 years, had tears in his eyes. Derek tried to fight back, claiming the evidence was fabricated, insisting that Sarah was lying out of spite, demanding that everyone ignore Saren's jealous delusions. But his voice shook with desperation. And when I played the recording of him discussing money laundering with his financial advisor, he finally broke down completely. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I was going to pay Saren back. I was building something bigger, something that would benefit the whole family. I just needed time to make it work." 5 years, Derek, I shot back. "You needed 5 years to figure out how to share stolen money, and in the meantime, you let Mom and Dad humiliate me at every family gathering, using your fake success to make me feel worthless." That's when Mom finally found her voice. "This can't be true," she whispered, looking between Derek and me like we were strangers. "Derek, tell them this isn't true. Tell them Saren is lying." The silence that followed said everything. Derek couldn't deny the evidence, couldn't explain away the recordings, couldn't justify 5 years of letting his family believe he was a financial genius, while I struggled to pay rent on money that should have been mine. But the real devastation came when Dad spoke. "Margaret," he said to Mom, his voice hollow. "Remember what Sam said to me at the hospital right before he died? He said, 'Make sure my grandchildren are both taken care of. Make sure Saren knows how much I loved her.'" Mom's face crumpled. Oh God, we've been so horrible to her. Derek, how could you do this to your own sister?" The party dissolved into chaos. Some relatives left immediately disgusted and embarrassed. Others stayed to demand more details to understand how they'd been fooled for so long. Uncle Mike quietly informed Derek that he'd be reporting this conversation to the appropriate authorities, since federal crimes don't disappear just because they happen within families. Derek made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "You're all acting like I committed murder," he said, gesturing around the beautiful house. "This money has been put to good use. I've created value, built assets, generated income. Saren would have just wasted her inheritance on rent and student loans." The arrogance of that statement, the casual dismissal of my right to decide how to use my own inheritance, finally pushed Dad over the edge. "Get out," he said to Derek, his voice shaking with rage. Get out of this house that you bought with stolen money and don't contact any of us until you've made this right. Dad, you can't be serious, I said, get out. 3 months later, Derek's world had completely collapsed. The IRS froze all his assets pending investigation. The FBI charged him with elder fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. His employer fired him when the charges became public. His mortgage companies began foreclosure proceedings on all his properties when he couldn't make payments without access to his hidden assets. But the most satisfying part wasn't Derek's legal troubles, it was watching him lose the one thing he'd valued most, his family's admiration. Mom and Dad, devastated by their role in enabling Derek's fraud and mistreating me, threw themselves into making amends. They sold their house and gave me the proceeds as a down payment on my own home. They publicly apologized to extended family members for their years of favoritism and cruel comparisons. The inheritance Derek stole was eventually recovered through asset forfeiture plus interest and penalties that brought the total to nearly $2 million. But more importantly, I got something back that was worth even more than money: my self-respect, my family's respect, and the knowledge that I'd never been the failure they'd convinced me I was. Derek, meanwhile, is currently serving 4 years in federal prison. His appeals have been denied, his assets remain frozen, and his reputation is permanently destroyed. He writes me letters, sometimes claiming he's learned his lesson and asking for forgiveness. I return them unopened. The last time I saw him was at his sentencing hearing. As the judge read the verdict, Derek looked across the courtroom at me with an expression of pure hatred. In that moment, I realized he still didn't understand what he'd really stolen from me. It wasn't just money, it was 5 years of my life spent believing I was worthless, undeserving, fundamentally inferior to someone who was actually a criminal. But those days are over. I now live in a beautiful home that I purchased with my rightfully recovered inheritance. I've expanded my accounting practice and specialize in helping families protect elderly relatives from financial abuse. And every time I walk through my front door, I remember that sometimes justice requires patience, evidence, and the courage to destroy everything you thought you knew about the people who were supposed to love you. Some people say I went too far, that family should forgive family no matter what. But Derek didn't just steal money, he stole my identity, my self-worth, and my family's love through years of calculated deception. When someone builds their entire life on destroying yours, forgiveness becomes less important than justice. And justice, as it turns out, tastes even sweeter when it's served in front of 43 witnesses at a housewarming party, paid for with stolen money. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was living a lie that affected your entire life? How did you handle learning that years of pain and self-doubt were based on someone else's deception? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and seeking justice when those two things became impossible to reconcile? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most healing thing is knowing you're not alone in dealing with family betrayal and manipulation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama that proves truth really can be stranger than fiction. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt like the family scapegoat or wondered if their relatives' success stories were too good to be true. Thank you for listening to my journey from family doormat to justice warrior. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even, it's getting everything you were owed in the first place, plus the satisfaction of watching karma work its magic in real time. Remember, blood may be thicker than water, but it's not thicker than truth, and anyone who builds their success on your destruction doesn't deserve your loyalty, no matter what DNA you share. Until next time, keep questioning those success stories that seem too perfect, trust your instincts when something doesn't add up, and never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you know you are. Sometimes the biggest family revelation isn't discovering you have more relatives, it's discovering which ones were never really family at all.